Welcome back to another episode of Divorce at Altitude. This is Ryan Kalamaya. This week, Amy and I are in different rooms, but we are recording this from our new office. Amy, what do you think about the new digs?
Oh, it's great. Yeah, it's just awesome having our team in the same office. So I'm really psyched about it.
We're going to talk about mental mindsets and client management. How might that might relate to our office? And before we kind of segue into that, where is our new office? Where is it located?
We are next to Cherry Creek. So we're essentially on like where Exposition hits Colorado Boulevard. So we're in the new Galleria building. So it's really a cool spot and we'll have an open house, I think, soon too.
Yeah, and I'm down here. I had some presentations, or a presentation, one rather, with the judicial conference in Boulder, and then I'm heading out on a family vacation and seeing some family down here. So it's been fun to connect with you guys and the team here. But we, as I said before, we're recording this while we're in the same area, but and it's a little weird where you're over in the same or the different office. But what are we going to talk about here today, Amy?
We're going to talk about client management, especially in the context of divorce or if you're going through a custody dispute. Like emotions are super high. And so you are dealing with life-changing things, you hire your lawyer. And so we're going to talk about how best to manage that from a client perspective, but also an attorney perspective, and how to get the results that you want. And really understanding your mental mindset is key in that management.
One, you have a unique perspective on this because you've both been a divorce client and you're a divorce lawyer. We'll come back to that, but let's kind of kick things off. The first topic that we want to talk about, or segment rather, is the client perspective of they're just completely falling apart. They need their lawyer just to do everything for them. They want the client or the attorney rather to do everything for them because they just are either emotionally incapable or they don't want to drive the train. So what do you make of this first segment?
Yeah, I think the client's mindset, like I would say, is like you feel like your life is falling apart. And so you're looking for someone to help guide your ship in the right direction because sometimes you don't even know what direction you should be going. And so I think from a client perspective, you're really looking for you hire a lawyer, you might really like them, you might connect with them, but you're really looking to them to guide you through this unknown process. And there can be good days and there can be bad days. There can be days where you feel optimistic, days where you're like, this is never going to end. What am I doing? And so I think from the lawyer perspective, it's super important to understand where your client is at. And you hear the saying a lot, meet people where they're at. And I do think that's true, but you have to also be able to understand that sometimes when people are in kind of flight or fight mode, they might not hear exactly what you're saying. Our job as lawyers is to give legal advice. It's to help clients navigate through the legal system to figure out what's in their children's best interests and to make sure that they're as financially whole as we can make them coming out of that disaster. And so I think understanding what's key to being an effective client manager from a lawyer perspective is to try to figure out how can I get through to my client? How are they going to be able to not only listen but understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, there are times when I can tell a client is completely overwhelmed and I'll ask them, "Hey, do you want me to, for example, I can have Anna, our paralegal, fill out your sworn financial statement. Ultimately, it's their testimony, and they are the ones that are responsible for it. I can't tell them, hey, you need to sign here and accept this settlement. Ultimately, it's I can tell them that that's my recommendation, and so there are certain things, but there's like getting the documents and making some decisions. It's having that candid conversation with the client about where they are at. I think also from the client perspective, one thing I think that's related to this topic is really taking an inventory of where you're at. It's naive to think that you're going to wake up every single day and feel amazing. There's going to be some days that you're like, I am so glad I'm getting divorced.
Yep.
But then there's other days. And we had a firm meeting earlier this week, and I shared that my perspective, I'm a baseball guy. So out of 10 times I would go up to bat, I felt two of them, I felt amazing on average. I just felt like I could just knock the socks off the pitcher. And then 2 days, two at bats, I would just feel awful. And it was those days in between, the 6 days, that really I focused on in terms of grinding it out and the difference between being a great player and a mediocre player. And I think people need to understand in their divorce, there's going to be some days that you feel absolutely awful and you need to give yourself some grace and just say, you know what, today's not the day. And then other days you're going to feel a little bit better, but you just need to be honest with yourself and what you're capable of doing in that particular moment of time.
Yeah, and I think as lawyers, like the really good family law attorneys like you, and after we've been doing this a long time, is understanding that sometimes what a client is saying might not be exactly like what A is going to be best for them or what they actually mean. So figuring that out, if they're saying like I'm overwhelmed, I just want out. It's our job as the attorney to like slow it down a little bit and run them through kind of those scenarios saying if you don't do this like down the road, like how are you going to do this? So I think it's also running clients through that those kind of future scenarios, because a lot of times when you're in the circumstance of crisis, all you can see is 2 feet in front of you. So I
Yeah,
find
well, I totally agree. Switching gears and talking about mental load and mindsets, that's something else that is related. But one thing I think maybe you can talk a little bit about, Amy, is the fog, the divorce fog, or the fog of litigation. It's definitely a real thing that I have observed. But do you want to talk a little bit about how that plays out when you're a divorced client?
yeah. And from the lawyer perspective, it's I've given my client advice. Now I need my client to execute on my directions. And so a lot of times what happens from the client perspective is we have what are called like what you're referring to as divorce fog, meaning that maybe we're not in the mental space to be able to exactly we say that we understand what you said I need to do, but I might not be capable of doing it because maybe I'm dealing with, and I'm just using myself as a hypothetical client, maybe I'm dealing with PTSD, maybe I have anxiety of the unknown. So someone talking at me doesn't necessarily mean that I completely understand and that I can move as quickly. I always tell clients that I think that when they're going through times of crisis, it's going to take them twice as long to do something that will take them an hour is going to take them 2 hours because they need that time to process.
I also think my observation from watching people go through this is that they feel completely overwhelmed, where they'll get these emails from us, or they'll just think about how am I going to really do all this? And especially this, I think this is acute when we're dealing with financial disclosures, where they will ask, I really have to do a full budget or a complete list of all my assets and expenses and assets. And the amazing thing is watching someone and saying, just take one step at a time, just do something, just take action. It doesn't have to be all today. And I think a lot of people will just wait and they procrastinate. And then, but if people just take that one step, okay, I'm going to download a bank statement. That's the first step. Then they start building on that and having momentum. But it is real that people that experience trauma or that they are clouded by their emotions and they can really get overwhelmed. I think that on the lawyer side, the lack of communication or responding because you're so busy and not responding, that just is the worst thing that can happen, because the anxiety and the not feeling heard, I can just see it where clients just go spiraling. And it's why I, for better or for worse, am so militant about
how responsive I am on the communication side. Yeah, and I would tell you from my like experience as a client, I if I send an email to my attorney and I don't hear back for a few days, it makes me feel that I'm not important to them and that like my kid or my issue just is that they're too busy. So I think as lawyers, we have to be very cognizant about how much we take on because people going through this kind of circumstance, their expectation is high. We live in an age of AI and instant response. So if you're going a few days without having a question answered, it's very concerning from a client perspective. Yeah, the expectation, or at least the thing that we communicate to our team is that we need to get back within 24 hours. If someone sends me a message at 8 o'clock at night, I'm not gonna respond. My assessment is that around 8 o'clock, the cost benefit analysis for me personally is just not worth it to check my email because what am I going to really be able to do at 8 o'clock at night versus the risk that I get some snarky email from an opposing counsel that ruins my night of sleep. It's just not worth it. But am I going to respond first thing in the morning? Yeah. And so we've tried to communicate that to our team. And am I perfect in that regard? No, no, I'm not. There's definitely, I feel right now that I've taken on a little bit too much, but the gold standard is to be in touch with our clients within 24 hours. And there's a reason for that. But moving on to our third kind of topic, and that's entrenchment and reactivity. And Amy, what happens when the other side makes a move that feels like an attack? Yeah, I think anytime, like perceived or not, as a client, when you see the other side doing something, it will freak you out. You're like, why are they doing this? Like they're making moves forward. And so when the other side does that, I think clients get very entrenched on, we need to be doing something. Like they're doing XYZ on this side. And so we need to be doing the same thing. When actually that can sometimes amp up the conflict in the case and frankly can make it more expensive. So I think from the attorney side, you really have to figure out how to explain to your client why like you don't need to be doing those things or why the other side is doing that and why it doesn't make sense for us to do that. I also run through sometimes saying if I'm the judge and I'm seeing opposing counsel doing this, like this is how I'm going to perceive it. And I think a lot of times in these cases, if someone isn't following the rules, it's very easy on the client side to be like, if they're not following the rules, why do I? And so I think it's from the lawyer perspective, we have to explain to them why it's so important that just because one side isn't following the rules, like you need to follow the rules. I think it's really hard to do nothing, but the analogy, and we communicate this to our clients, we have an email that talks about discovery, and the analogy is like a plane. I'm about to jump on a plane and go across the Atlantic Ocean for a vacation. And like when you first take off in a plane, you're excited, you're moving, you're getting going. It's like filing for divorce. It's like this is happening, and you can have mixed feelings. You can but know that there is movement. You feel it. And then you get up to cruising altitude, and then nothing feels like it's happening, and you're out there, and like sometimes, I mean, my kids are 8 and 11 at this point. They just start walking around because they just want to move something. Are they going anywhere? No, but they're like, they just want to move. I get that. I think it's human nature. But there's a lot of times when the client doesn't feel like something is happening. They don't understand that mandatory disclosures are being worked on, and they just don't feel like something is happening. And so they're just like, I want to do this. I want to subpoena that person. I want to do this deposition. I want you to file this. And it's just because they just want to walk around the plane. And then the landing, it can be bumpy, but you're landing that plane and you're getting a divorce. And but it's that middle part where people they start getting anxious and they start want to do something. The other observation I'll have is, and this is to the kind of reactivity and entrenchment, is that it is a common occurrence where Eric and Melanie Wolf will go through a divorce, and Eric will say that the sky is blue. And Amy, you and I will look up in the sky, and it is blue as can be. And Melanie will say the sky's not blue.
And it's just because Eric said that this guy was blue. It's just the nature of these kinds of disputes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the best lawyers, family lawyers, are the ones that do case, like talking about case management, like being proactive, having the case management meetings with clients to be like, this is what we're doing. Like, we're going to be doing this next. I find that in my cases, I tend to be the driver a lot of times on how things move through the process. And you and I have talked about this a lot, like how people, the longer their divorce goes on, they get unhappier. And it's because of that analogy of where they're just walking around the plane and nothing is happening. So I think like we can control what we can control, but being the lawyer that's pushing the case forward and having those check-ins with the client, I think helps with client management and the client feeling that like I have consistent and ongoing communication with my lawyer.
For sure. But then it's an art, not necessarily science, because there are those cases where you can push things along and the other side is just gonna take a step backwards just because you want to push things along. And you just have to understand the emotional perspective of both people. If one person, if Melanie Wolf is just not ready, sometimes you got to give her just space and let her process things. And it may not, it hopefully doesn't cost that much to give her the space. But you have to have that conversation with Eric of, we're going to be intentional about, this is not going to be productive. We might have mediation next week, but she is just not ready. And so it may be worthwhile to discuss rescheduling in that regard because of that reactivity and entrenchment that might be going on Melanie.
Yeah, and I think the hardest cases are the ones where the other side is not doing what they're supposed to, whether it be giving you the discovery, like even the attorney calling you back, and just really communicating that with the client. There are certain things sometimes that we have to do, like hoops we have to jump through. And maybe it's not filing like a motion, a forthwith motion with the court. Maybe it's asking for a status conference. So it's just making clients understand like what are the options and what really is going to get you the result that you're actually looking for.
That brings us to my favorite topic, and that is that when lawyers are clients. I have represented a number of lawyers. I have called many of them friends. And why, Amy, are lawyers the hardest clients? You've both been a lawyer, you are a lawyer and a client. So why are you, just generally speaking, a difficult client?
I think we lawyers are difficult clients because we know enough about the process. The problem is that we are mom, we are the wife, we are the husband, we are the dad. And so this is not in necessarily our analytical part of our brain. It's like our life as like a in a family. And so it's really hard. Those get very mixed easily. And so I think it's hard sometimes for lawyers going through a divorce to really think clearly and analytically about I can do all of these things, but is that actually going to get me the result that I need? So I think that lawyers are difficult clients because they want to drive the bus where they really need to let their lawyer drive the bus because they're not in the mental state to see 1,000 feet ahead instead of the 2 feet ahead.
Yeah, there's a cardinal rule that you never represent yourself as a lawyer. And but some lawyers, I'm not saying that you were one of these, I never represented you, but it's one of those things where lawyers will often be the backside or backseat driver or the sideline quarterback, whatever, pick your own metaphor there, in the sense that they like know if they're litigators, they know about written discovery and they know about depositions. And so they'll say, this is how you should do it, whether they're a civil litigator or a water lawyer or a real estate lawyer, whatever it is. And so they'll project, hey, this is what I do, or this is what we do in this circumstance. And it's difficult to be like, you're playing in my sandbox here, Eric or Melanie, and you've hired me and like, we do things differently. And so that can be difficult. I also think lawyers, just as a general segment of the population, they tend to be alpha dogs or they like to win. There's like a winning attitude in there that kind of can really escalate in a divorce. And so there are those dynamics that can be very challenging for a divorce involving a lawyer.
Yeah, and I think since I am a divorce attorney and I've been a divorce client, the more divorce attorneys that I've talked to that also have been a divorce client, I think one thing that's super challenging is that if you have a reputation as a good divorce attorney and you have an attorney, a lot of times the dynamic of the client management is hard because this lawyer has a good reputation. I'm going to defer more to what he or she is saying instead of driving the bus. So I think that can cause like on the or on the strategy piece to not just defer to your client just because he or she is a lawyer either.
Well, enough about lawyers, or at least lawyers as clients. Amy, talk to me about managing expectations and managing hope.
Yeah, I think as lawyers, that's one of the biggest jobs that we have. I know that it can be very hard sometimes when new judges are coming and rotating in and out of various domestic dockets. But I think just managing expectations when it comes to outcomes and really talking to clients about what is actually the court's perspective on this. This may be like a big deal to you, but the court is not necessarily going to see that. And the court might view you as being hyper controlling or something like that. So I think just giving people realistic expectations of outcomes, but also on the timeline. If you go through the court process, it can be super slow depending on the district that you're in. So I think, just having those conversations early on and continuing to have those conversations can help with client management and client expectation.
Yeah, we talked about on this podcast several times that one of the most common questions or comments that we get in initial consultations is, I want full custody, or Melanie Wolf, she wants full custody. And then it's disabusing them of there is no such thing as full custody in Colorado. But then also when Amy, we talk in particular about children disputes, how long it's going to take, but then also managing their expectations of saying, listen, we can go to court and a judge will listen, but they'll be the first ones to admit they are going to spend a fraction of the time, even though we have some wonderful judges across the state. I was presenting and I know that they really want to learn and do best, but the reality is that Eric and Melanie Wolf are going to pay way more attention to the particularities of their children and their circumstances and are going to be able to come up with a schedule or whatever it may be relating to their kids that is far better than anything a judge is going to do. And having that reality check with Eric and Melanie, that is something that I think is challenging at first, for sure, to say you had kids with them, you're gonna have to work with them. The flip side is that there are cases where they just fundamentally are just going to disagree. They might disagree over decision making, or they just might disagree on a parenting schedule. But I think I see you nodding and saying yes. I think that the majority of people, they don't understand the limitations both from a time and how the quality or the detail that a judge is going to give to their particular situation.
Yeah, I have time and time again, judges have told me that it's hard for them to get the nuance that is needed in family law cases because of the time. It has nothing to do with like how much they care about family and kids. So yeah, it's
Um,
it,
Wrapping up with the final topic, and that's humanizing the process and reframing key issues in terms of the impact on the kids. Amy, what should we think in terms of how your child will experience this decision? What do we make of that?
I think that because we have a system that is set up as an adversarial process where we're put into the system where, civil cases, criminal cases, family dynamics are so different than like those types of cases. I think that a lot of times it's set up for each party to have their own lawyer. We're in this adversarial process. And so it's easy, I think, for each side, each client to be like, what's best for me? What's best for mom? What's best for dad? And I think if you can, as a lawyer, reframe it and try to really focus your client on the kid and what is the kid's experience going to be, that can break a client out of that entrenchment of like just thinking about themselves.
Indeed. I think that when you talk about the humanizing the process, I think litigation is certainly legal in nature, but a lot of it is just emotional survival. And I don't think people realize how stressful disputes or trying to resolve those disputes through litigation and the impact it has on the kids. And the research is overwhelmingly clear that yes, there may be some personality disorders and substance abuse and deficient parents out there, but the overwhelming number or the overwhelming statistics are that the two people together creating disputes is the worst thing for the kids. It takes two to tango. It is often a dynamic between two people, and I've said it before on this podcast, but when Eric and Melanie, when they come to the judge and they say this other person's a lying, stealing thief, the judge is going to sit there and say, you married them. And so that is really hard for people to hear. But Amy, anything you want to conclude with, and any calls to action or other components to put a wrap on this?
Yeah, I think just my kind of final thoughts on the humanizing the process. I think from the lawyer perspective, being able to, when I'm talking about reframing, saying, I hear what you're saying, this is so frustrating, taking the long view, here are the options. Because I think then your client understands that you hear them and they're more likely to be able to hear and understand and frankly make better decisions based off of what you're saying. And I do think just after going through this process, like the courts can only do so much. As a client and as a lawyer, you need to figure out how to be creative and when to let things go and when it's not okay to let things go. So I think there is an art to that as well.
Indeed. Thank you, everyone, all the listeners that have made it this far, for joining us on Divorce at Altitude. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have any questions or comments, we welcome. Our emails are publicly available, so we welcome the feedback. And until next time, thank you for joining us on Divorce Altitude. Hey everyone, this is Ryan again. Thank you for joining us on Divorce at Altitude. If you found our tips, insight, or discussion helpful, please tell a friend about this podcast. For show notes, additional resources, or links mentioned on today's episode, visit divorceataltitude.com. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen in. Many of our episodes are also posted on YouTube. You can also find Amy and me at kalamaya.law or 970-315-2365. That's KALAMAYA.law.